to Gates, spoilers reveal that at Fairmont Crest, disaster rarely arrives with warning. It seeps in through silence, through a look held a second too long, through the uneasy feeling that something inside a marriage has shifted even before anyone can name it. That was the feeling stalking Bill after the robbery involving Hayley. On the surface, everything about her invited sympathy. She looked shaken, wounded, fragile enough to make any husband want to protect her from whatever had happened. But the more Bill watched her, the more he felt that her fear was not as simple as she wanted him to believe. It was not only the fear of a woman who had been violated by violence. It was the fear of someone who knew the story was more dangerous than the version she was telling. What troubled Bill most was not the robbery itself, but Hayley's insistence on steering suspicion toward Randy. She did not just mention his name. She pressed it, shaped it, returned to it again and again with a precision that felt rehearsed. At first, Bill tried to excuse it as panic. A frightened woman would naturally reach for the nearest explanation, the nearest enemy, the nearest person she could blame for the chaos. But Hayley's version of events was almost too polished. Her distress looked real, yet somehow arranged around a purpose. The more she talked, the more Bill felt she was not searching for justice. She was building a shield. That was when he turned to Joey. Bill did not like needing him, and he liked even less what it said about the state of his marriage. A husband who asks another man to investigate his wife is already standing in the ruins of trust, even if the walls have not fully fallen yet. But Joey understood darkness in a way other men did not. He knew how lies moved through a town like Fairmont Crest. He knew how money traveled when fear was attached to it, how people concealed guilt inside outrage, how the guilty often rushed to identify a villain before anyone else had asked for one. Bill told himself he wanted clarity. In truth, he was preparing himself for damage. Joey began where official investigators would never go. He looked at disposable phones, quiet payments, back-channel favors, names that were never written down but always remembered in the right circles. It did not take long for him to find the first crack. A phone had been purchased, activated briefly before the robbery, then destroyed. On its own, that meant little. But the money trail leading to it bent too close to people Hayley had insisted were irrelevant. There were small inconsistencies everywhere, weak enough to deny individually but powerful when placed side by side. A hidden expense, a contact routed through a familiar orbit, a meeting point that suggested arrangement, not randomness. Joey did not need a confession to recognize the shape of a setup. When he quietly laid out the pattern for Bill, the effect was worse than certainty. Bill had not received the clean answer he secretly wanted. He had not been given absolute proof that Hayley was innocent, nor enough direct evidence to condemn her without question. Instead, he got something uglier, the outline of a betrayal. Enough to see that Hayley had not simply suffered the robbery. She had been too close to the machinery behind it, too aware, too invested in controlling what happened afterward. The realization settled into Bill like a sickness. He felt ashamed before he felt angry, shame that he had believed her so easily, shame that he had allowed affection to dull his instincts. Shame that he might have built his future around a woman whose helplessness had been, at least in part, a performance. That humiliation fed his rage, but not in an explosive way. It turned him cold. He began watching Hayley differently, listening for gaps instead of comfort. He replayed every moment since the robbery, and found something false in all of them. Her trembling hands, her carefully broken expressions, the way she seemed less focused on what had been taken than on who ought to be blamed. Bill started to understand that if Hayley had shaped any part of this, then she had done more than lie. She had used his instincts against him. She had turned his protectiveness into a weapon he aimed at the wrong target. That possibility disgusted him almost as much as it hurt him. Hayley, meanwhile, felt the change without knowing exactly how much Bill had learned. His silence altered. It no longer felt like the silence of concern, but the silence of calculation. He stopped moving toward her with the same reflexive care. He stopped cushioning every hard moment with reassurance. He looked at her the way one studies a crack in glass, trying to see how far it runs beneath the surface. That frightened her more than shouting would have. Anger could still be managed. Silence meant he was thinking, and thought was dangerous. Her desperation sharpened around Randy. He had always been her most useful target because enough dirt clung to his name to make any accusation plausible, but now he was becoming a liability in a new way. If he sensed he was being cornered, he might protect himself by exposing the pieces Hayley needed buried. He knew too much about the version of her she had worked so hard to conceal. He knew she was not only vulnerable and frightened, but calculating, survival-driven, willing to shape a story if that was what it took to hold on to power and security. The more Hayley imagined Randy speaking, the more her fear became obsession. She stopped thinking in terms of truth or lies and started thinking only in terms of control. That was the tragedy at the center of her unraveling. Hayley had likely never intended the situation to grow as monstrous as it had. What began as pressure, leverage, or manipulation had expanded into something she could no longer fully direct. The robbery was no longer just an event. It was a living threat, one that connected her to people she could not trust and to choices she could not undo. Part of her fear was fraudulent, but part of it had become horrifyingly real. She had opened a door, and now consequences were moving through it faster than she could shut it. Joey discovered as much when he traced another payment through one of Randy's old connections. This was not greed money, it was fear money, the kind paid after a plan begins to slip apart. Someone had been trying to contain fallout, to keep certain mouths closed, to make sure the public version of the robbery stayed simple while the private one remained buried. The more Joey followed the trail, the clearer it became that Hayley had not stood wholly outside the event. She had helped create the circumstances around it, and then had lost control of what those circumstances became. Bill absorbed each revelation like a blow. He kept hoping for some final piece that would swing everything back into place, some hidden explanation that would make Hayley's behavior look misguided rather than corrupt. But each step forward only made her more complex and less forgivable. She was not a helpless victim, yet she was not untouched by the danger either. She had participated in something reckless and manipulative, then become trapped inside it, terrified of exposure and increasingly willing to sacrifice others to save herself. Bill's grief deepened because this version of her was harder to dismiss than a simple villain would have been. If she had been purely cruel, he could have hated her cleanly. Instead, he was faced with a woman whose weakness had curdled into strategy, and whose strategy had turned into panic. Randy, sensing pressure from all sides, began preparing his own defense. He was not brave enough to confront anyone directly, but he was cunning enough to preserve fragments that might buy him time. A saved message, a remembered location. A partial thread connecting Hayley to decisions she now wanted erased. He knew she would gladly let him carry the whole burden if that was what it took to protect herself. He also knew she would be most dangerous when frightened. That understanding made him cautious, but it also made him reckless in another way. He allowed the possibility of his speaking out to circulate just enough to unsettle the people who feared him most. He wanted leverage. Instead, he helped turn the situation into a powder keg. Bill finally confronted Hayley, but not with the wild explosion she may have expected. He approached her with restraint, asking questions that sounded simple but carried weight. Why had her story shifted around certain details? Why did she keep returning to Randy's name with such urgency? Why were there people on the edges of the robbery whose relevance she had concealed? Hayley tried to answer in layers, moving between offense, vulnerability, exhaustion, and wounded disbelief. Under other circumstances, those shifts might have worked. But Bill was no longer listening as a husband desperate to preserve peace. He was listening as a man measuring deceit. What he heard was enough. Not a confession, but weakness, hesitation where there should have been outrage, over-explanation where there should have been clarity. Fear that flared most sharply, not when she described the robbery itself, but when she sensed that he no longer believed her. Bill felt something vital break then. He saw that Hayley was not trying to heal with him. She was trying to stay ahead of collapse. The realization scorched him. He had not merely misjudged her. He had allowed himself to become part of a narrative built to secure her position and redirect his loyalty. Every memory of tenderness now carried suspicion. Every intimate moment felt contaminated by strategy. Hayley, once she realized Bill had stepped beyond doubt and into suspicion, stopped thinking like a wife and started thinking like a survivor. Her panic became brutal. She considered every option at once, running, destroying evidence, confronting Randy before he could move first, inventing a new story in which she had been manipulated more than involved. What made her frightening now was not calm intelligence, but desperation. She was losing the elegance of her lies. They no longer unfolded smoothly. They collided. The more she tried to shape events, the more her contradictions exposed the truth she could not afford to say plainly. She had played with danger because she believed she could control it, and now she was drowning in it. Joey's next breakthrough made the situation even worse. One of his men found proof that Randy had been storing insurance against exactly this kind of collapse. There was a partial voice recording and enough surrounding detail to show that Hayley had not conceived the robbery as a random act against herself, but had tolerated or encouraged pressure tactics that were supposed to create fear, dependence, and emotional leverage. Somewhere in execution, the situation escalated beyond what she expected. That did not absolve her. It made her more tragic and more dangerous. Her terror after the fact had not been entirely fake. It had been the terror of someone who realized the monster she invited in was no longer listening to her. When Joey shared this with Bill, whatever remained of his denial died. He understood at last that Hayley had needed more than sympathy. She had needed control. She had wanted to shape his emotional world, to pull him closer through crisis, to direct his anger outward while securing her place beside him as the wronged woman he must defend. Instead, she had triggered a chain reaction involving unstable men, hidden money, and real risk. Bill's pain became absolute. His marriage was no longer something in trouble. It was something built over a sinkhole. Still, the cruelest part was that his feelings did not vanish on contact with the truth. Bill still remembered loving her. He still remembered the softness she had offered, whether real or staged. That memory made him furious with her and with himself. She had not simply lied about events. She had poisoned the past. There was no untouched place left in his memory of them, no moment he could revisit without wondering what she had wanted from him in that instant. A man like Bill could survive disappointment. What hollowed him out was the possibility that he had mistaken manipulation for intimacy. Hayley, terrified that Bill and Joey now knew too much, made the mistake desperate people always make. She tried to rewrite the story one more time. She reached for a version in which Randy was more fully responsible, in which she had only been drawn in and then frightened into silence. There were traces of truth in that version, which gave it temporary strength. But desperation had made her clumsy. She no longer knew how to blend truth and fiction without letting their seams show. Bill saw it. Joey saw it. Even Hayley, somewhere beneath the panic, knew it. Randy only added to the chaos. Instead of disappearing, he tried to preserve room for bargaining by letting the possibility of exposure drift through back channels. He wanted everyone to understand that if he fell, he would not fall alone. That message reached Joey quickly enough to darken the entire situation. Now this was no longer just about betrayal inside a marriage. It was about what frightened people might do when they believed they were out of time. Joey understood the danger at once. Once fear starts moving between compromised people, violence is never far behind. By then, Bill was trapped between two forms of devastation. If he exposed Hayley fully, he would destroy the marriage and invite scandal that would spread far beyond them. If he buried the truth, he would be preserving a lie that had already humiliated him and endangered others. Neither option offered dignity. Neither offered peace. He felt anger, grief, contempt, and a lingering bitter ghost of love that made every choice worse. Hayley stood before him as both architect and casualty of her own design, a woman whose need for security had mutated into manipulation, then into panic, then into something nearly feral. Joey moved around them with the patience of a man who had seen too many collapses to romanticize another one. Randy lurked like the final stain that would not wash out, proof that once dirt enters a plan, it never stays where it was first placed. In the end, the most painful truth was not that evil had won, but that none of this began with pure evil at all. It began with hunger. Hayley's hunger for protection, status, and certainty. Bill's hunger to believe in a softer future. Randy's hunger to profit and survive. Joey's hunger to know what was hidden in the dark, in Fairmont Crest. Those hungers never stay small. They grow sharp edges. They turn love into leverage, vulnerability into theater, fear into strategy, and marriage into a battleground where honesty arrives too late to save anyone. By the time Bill saw the full shape of that, the damage was already irreversible. Hayley was no longer simply hiding a secret. She had become the center of a crisis she could not contain. Bill was no longer just a wounded husband. He was a man deciding whether mercy toward her would mean betrayal of himself. And the silence hanging over their home no longer felt temporary. It felt like the first stillness before a final collapse.